you attach to 15, 20 pounds, absolutely bar of silver. These fish have to survive under the ice during the winter for 8 months almost. So they packed on weight before they enter the river to the point where they have a very small head and huge hump. They're incredibly well prepared for winter. And there's many of them, and they're completely wild.
That was Mariusz Wroblewski describing what Kamchatku steelhead look like and feel like. This is the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. In today's episode, I talk with Mariusz Wroblewski with a focus on steelhead. We find out which rod is the perfect rod for all-around steelhead fishing in the two-handed range, and how to match a sink tip and line for this rod. Then we get into a little bit on the Wild Salmon Center and talk about what he's been doing over the years to protect steelhead. Ed Ward, Tim Rajeff, Scott O'Donnell, Deck Hogan are all on tap for topics today as we dig into steelhead on the OP, Deschutes, and Kamchatku. So, without further ado, here's Mariusz Wroblewski. We've got a ton of topics to talk about today. The challenge is going to be focusing it down. I think the Wild Salmon Center, Echo fly rods, Kamchatku, steelhead. I mean, just those topics, any of those four we could dig way into. So we're gonna kind of go around. I think this would touch on it, but maybe you can just start us off how you first got into fly fishing and how that all came to be. With Echo, and maybe let's just start there. How you got into it and how you came to Echo.
I came to the United States as a political immigrant, as a refugee in 1989. And the first place, I landed in San Francisco, and the first place I saw was Golden Gate Angling and Casting Club, and which kind of became almost second home for me. And of course, the Rajeff family was there, Tim, Steve, and their father, George. And since George spoke Russian, so did I, we kind of became friends, and I almost got adopted by the Rajeff family and got involved in tournament casting, and I've been friends with Tim and Steve ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. So 1989, back in,
yep.
I mean, that was, and where are you from originally?
Poland.
Oh, Poland, yeah. So 1989, I mean, that was kind of the collapse of the, was that the time when it all kind of the fall of the kind of the Russia, right? That you were in the middle of that?
Right. That was the end of communism, but I left Poland still during the martial law before the system collapsed. So, in the last moment, pretty much.
No kidding. Wow. That's right. And then you ran into the Rajeff family, which sounds like a pretty amazing story. And I didn't even, the father, I guess George, I haven't heard that name too often. I mean, when you look back, and maybe we could just look back at the Rajeff family, is there something that sticks out to you that, that they taught you over the years, or something maybe, Tim, you learned from him?
Well, absolutely. I think they had a profound impact on my personal life and fly fishing life as well. Besides getting into the tournament casting and sort of going all the way to the national tournament, I also ended up in Russia on Kola Peninsula, taking Tim's place, running the famous Penoy River company operation, Atlantic salmon fly fishing operation on Kola Peninsula.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. So yeah, you've been involved for a long time, and now Echo, I know. Can you talk a little bit about when Echo started? Because it wasn't going then. I think it started a little bit later than that period.
Right. Tim left Penoy in 1994. Briefly, I believe, worked for Loomis a little bit, and then started Echo or Rajeff Sports.
Yeah.
And we've been friends then, and the whole Penoy period overlap with the beginning of the Spey casting sort of introduction to U.S. and development. We hosted on the Penoy some of the sort of pioneers like Derek Brown and Simon Gawesworth and Leif Stavmo. So this was the right place and right moment to experiment with Spey casting and Spey rods. When I came to Penoy in '94, I would say 90% of our guests were fishing single-handed rods. When I was leaving the Penoy in '99, I would say that 90% were Spey casting.
Yep. Wow, that's cool. So basically, yeah, I mean, you've been involved in the Spey casting and at the very beginning, and we've talked a lot about that on this podcast, you know, some of the people that were involved and, you know, Deck and some of the people that were early on in that whole crew. You know, I want to get into choosing a Spey rod because I think things have changed obviously over the years and there's new people coming in all the time. And I want to make it real clear for them how to get started, what they need, and with the focus on winter steelhead. Before we get there, the Wild Salmon Center, I really want to touch on that just a second here, because I think that's obviously a very important part of steelhead and recovery. Can you talk about how you came into, I mean, we bring it back to 89, you know, back as a refugee and then meeting Tim. How do you get involved in the Wild Salmon Center?
Actually through Penoy, through fishing on the Kola Peninsula. In '99, I left Penoy to go to graduate school at Berkeley in California. And I was working on the Yokanga River, which is another Atlantic salmon river on the Kola Peninsula. And I met Spencer Beebe, who was at that time CEO of EcoTrust in Portland, Oregon. This is a sort of conservation, big organization. The fish and fish conservation was just a little part of it. But I met him on a Penoy. He came to fish with two of his board members, and he offered me a job at EcoTrust running British Columbia program, conservation program in British Columbia. So I spent 5 years in the Skeena watershed. Also starting something called Skeena Wild Conservation Trust. And of course, I had a chance to fish for steelhead a lot. And 5 years into that program, I was approached by director of Wild Salmon Center with a job offer to run the Russian Far East program, which covers Kamchatka, Sakhalin Island, and Khabarovsk region, which is the mainland of Russian Far East.
Gotcha. Wow, this is cool. You're like you're like a rock star as far as you know, like the steelhead conservation. I mean, everything you know, the Skeena is a hot. You know, right. I've been up there. I mean, it's an amazing place, and I mean, the Kamchatka, Skeena, West Coast steelhead. If you look at the whole Pacific Rim, can you just briefly? I've had John McMillan on, and he talked. We don't talk a lot about conservation on this episode, just because it's really focused more on tips and tricks. But you know, it's interesting. John dug into the steelhead. We talked a lot of it wasn't based on. Some of it wasn't based on data. You know, we just talked about generally our thoughts of where we are, where we're going. Can you just touch on that just briefly? You know, you're obviously right in the middle of it. You know, I mean, we're at a down, right? We're at a real low on that trend line, right, for steelhead this year, a lot of places. But what's your take on it? Where are we headed, and are there positive signs out there?
Yeah, there are definitely positive signs. For example, in Kamchatka, there are two systems that I'm familiar with: Uthulok and Kvachina River on the north. West of Kamchatka, where population it's a relatively small systems, maybe 50, 60 kilometers long, but the populations are up to 30,000 fish. And what's most amazing about it is the diversity of life histories of these fish. So they have a variety of life history strategies that allow them to occupy the whole system and actually thrive. So this is the sort of place that you can measure the rest of the steelhead systems around the Pacific Rim. And, you know, Kamchatka is doing extremely well. Skeena is doing fairly well. Since 2006, there's a very good organization, Skeena Wild Conservation Trust, I already mentioned, working there. And since then, the commercial fishery that that sort of steelhead is a bycatch of has been really curbed and much smaller than it used to be, and steelhead sort of rebounding back to better days of 40,000 steelhead for the Skeena system. The further south we go, I'm sure everybody knows that the further south we move, the situation is a little bit less rosy, with all the dams, with all the hatcheries, with all the pressure on these fish and interception in commercial fisheries, and also angling pressure. There's no question about it. Just these runs in lower 48 are definitely suppressed, not in very good shape. And with climate change sort of rolling over this whole situation, it doesn't look it's gonna get any better anytime soon. So the dam removal, for example, on the Klamath River will show us what the fish are capable of.
Wow, yeah, that's a good point. And climate change obviously is a hot topic, is a huge topic. How do you guys, if we just stay on that track a little bit, we've talked a little bit about all the dams and the 4-H's and things like that. Climate change seems to be that one big factor that looms over it all. How do you guys think about climate change and how that affects steelhead and what we do?
Well, it's a question of resilience. Climate change is not a new thing in the sort of geological history of the Pacific Northwest. The warming periods happened before, and we know that fish was able to adapt to those. But that was the wild fish, and it took a long time for them to genetically get adjusted to warmer water, the shorter periods they can get into the river and spawn. There was plenty of time and very few factors that affect negatively populations before. Right now, we are sort of facing cumulative impact on these fish and the rivers, with warming water, with the dams being still in place, with water withdrawals from many rivers. So we have a sort of much more complicated situation. And I think our best chance to address that is allowing wild fish to do their thing. They have done it successfully before, and they will be able to do it again if we provide the most favorable conditions, if we don't interfere with. So I'm kind of pointing probably at the hatchery releases that are that they have a most impact on the genetic composition of these populations. The more hatchery fish in the river and the more of them spawn with wild fish, the more diluted that genetic composition becomes, and the fish are less adapted to their environment and rapid changes in that environment. Yeah, no, that's and that's an awesome point. And I kind of brings me back to John again, McMillan. He mentioned, we were talking about the Columbia. I guess we focused a little bit on the Columbia, and that just like you said, the Columbia has been hit hard by everything, all those H's but he did say, he saw a lot of positives as well. And one of them was that even though the runs are down, when you look at wild runs, they're actually doing a lot better than the returns of hatchery fish, right? I mean, the Columbia pours out millions of fish. So I think, again, on that wild fish piece, and that's what you guys do, right? You're protecting some of the best wild fish sanctuaries in the world. Right. That's the mission of the organization. We believe that the system of strongholds that will allow survival and thriving of the best remaining populations will be key to first sort of pave the way for the rest of the systems to sort of fare well with the coming challenges. Gotcha. And is the Skeena, is that system is still, I know the runs are down a little bit there, but I mean, is that one kind of a little more, I guess, protected, right, than some of the further south basins? Yeah. Right, definitely. Skeena is, first of all, it doesn't have doesn't have any dams for one, then doesn't have some of the hatchery impact that we experience here, and it has a very strong community. I think this is the most important part. The sort of resilience of the place is as much of a sort of natural resilience. British Columbia doesn't experience the sort of radical changes in weather as hard as we do, and also a resilience of community. There's a very many people devoted to keeping their home watershed intact. So that's been very impressive how the community in Skeena is very aware of what's going on, and it has a very clear idea how to deal with it. Which I think down south we're a little bit more fractured. There's a lot of us who appreciate hatchery fish for harvest. There's a lot of us who are very straightforward on wild only, and that produces the conflict that leads to certain sort of stagnant environment or community that it's not very focused and not very unified in the effort.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Well, this is good. I mean, obviously, this is a huge topic, and maybe we can leave this for a later episode if we can, get you back on and talk a little more about the conservation. But I did want to dig into, I've got a steelhead trip. Well, here you go. Keeping on that topic, I guess it's all around conservation. But the OP is a place that is a very popular place, and I know the runs are down there as well in some rivers. But we've got a trip I'm doing up there with a small group of people, and a lot of them are new to steelhead fishing, right? And they're questioning. They don't know what rod to take, what lines to take. Can we just maybe dig into a little bit on rods, the two-handed rod specifically, and kind of maybe talk about what somebody needs to get started?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think the best place to start the conversation about choosing the right tackle for the fishing you planning on doing is exactly the place, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't fish the same rod on the Skeena and the same rod on the Sandy River next to Portland, because the size, sort of magnitude of the river is absolutely different. But there are ways to sort of bring this down to something that is going to
a little simplified.
Yeah.
Is there a, when you think about that, because I was just talking to, Evan, your marketing, main manager there, and we were talking about lengths of rod a little bit, and that's a thing where, you hear 13 foot, 13 foot, 6 inch, 13 foot, 12 foot, right? I mean, you got all these things, and so to keep it focused, let's first think winter steelhead. So we're going to be tossing some larger skagit, bigger flies. And then let's also just keep it focused. Let's just say the OP, which I know there's some different size rivers there as well, but if we think about some of the rivers there, as our rod, what would you choose there for a winter steel? What's a good all-around winter steelhead two-handed rod?
Well, it definitely is the 7-weight, the 13-foot length. That's why we have the series called Full Spey. There's only 3 rods in that series, 6, 7, and 8, and all of them are 13 foot. And why that? Because we feel like you can do almost anything with the 13-foot rod. And also, there's no bed rod really. There are only bed combinations of line and rod. So airflow lines are pretty much catered to that kind of rod, that kind of length and of the rod. When you look at our Skagit Fist, for example, I would definitely recommend it Skagit Fist to take to any winter steelhead fishing, because the triple density line that is perfect length for the 13-foot rod, with addition of the sink tip, be that T11 or T14, depending on the depth of the run you're going to fish, you're pretty much going to cover every possible scenario. And with the cold water, the line that cuts through the surface currents and goes down and slows down the swing, it's sort of key to success in winter steelhead fishing.
Okay, and you mentioned so on the 7-weight. And why not go with an 8-weight on as far as for winters?
Oh, absolutely, you can do that. 7-weight is the sort of middle of the road that will allow you to fish in the summer.
Oh, gotcha.
But also effectively in the winter.
Yeah.
If you're more of a summer fisherman, let's say you fish the shoots,
Yep.
then a 6-weight during the summer would be a better choice, probably just simply a little bit more pleasant.
That's a
lighter
great call.
rod, lighter line. If you're fishing predominantly winter and bigger river with serious flow, then the 8-weight, I would definitely recommend 8-weight. It's going to allow you to use a little heavier line. The heavier line is going to carry out heavier sink tip, and heavier sink tip will turn over the biggest intruder you can put on it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. And no, I'm glad you said that because that makes sense. So if you wanted to go with one rod, the 7-weight would be great because it's kind of all
Right.
around. And if you want to go just winter steelhead, go with the 8, or just summer steelhead, go with the 6-weight. And that's cool. I actually, and I have a link at wetflyswing.com/echo, where I have a link over to the Gorge fly shop over there where they can check out some of these rods. So, okay, good. Well, that just clarifies that. Then let's just we're sticking with that 8-weight. We're just going winter steelhead. You mentioned the fist, the triple density. Can you talk a little bit about triple density lines versus dual or single? And do you need, when you're going for winter steelhead, is it good to have both of those types, or will triple do it all?
Well, I think it's good to have another skagit line, full floaters with you, because very often you're going to be fishing run that it's 2 to 3 feet deep, and the fist might be actually be too much for that kind of water.
Oh, yeah.
So on that you can put a 10 or longer feet sink tip, and you will be right at the fishing depth without snagging on the bottom all the time. As everybody knows, for Deck Hogan book, if you are catching the bottom, you are not fishing. You might be actually under the fish, and I think that in sort of tendency to go heavy and fish really heavy sink tips and heavy flies, a lot of times we sort of defeat the purpose of we fishing too deep, we snagging the bottom and not really presenting the fly the way we should.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then, so if we're talking fists for maybe more of the heavier, and we'll touch a little bit on the T, kind of the sink tips, but what would be a good, maybe if you had to pick another that's maybe a single, more of the get into the lighter, the shallower, what would be a good airflow line for that?
Well, there's a G2 line, which is a full designed by Tom Larimer, full floating skagit line that is of the same, more or less same length that fist, but it will allow you to fish a little bit more shallow and not be on the bottom all the time.
Okay, good. So we have that. And so let's just break down. So basically, again, for somebody new, we've talked a lot, the first 30 episodes, people can look at some of those steelhead episodes on this podcast. But if we break down, you have the line with the sink tips. How does that, you hear a lot about the poly leaders versus other, what's a good for winter steelhead? I mean, would you use poly leaders, or do you just go with a different type of sink tips for that?
No, definitely I wouldn't use poly leaders for winter fishing, because they will not effectively take the fly down into the zone where you want to be most of the time. So I would definitely go with the T11 or T14. Some people even go to T17 on the very deep, slow or strong current places. Usually T14 and T11 covers most of the places. There you can use different length everywhere from 5 feet of T11 or 14 to 10 and 12 and 15 in some cases. What's important, I think, is to make sure that your rig, your line weight, is capable of moving that sink tip. If you have a 400 grain head and you put a 15 feet of T14 or T17, your casting is going to be disaster, because the mass of the head of the floating part of the your rig is not going to be able to turn over. You add a weighted fly on the end of it, and it becomes impossible.
Is that isn't there a rule of thumb? Do you have one? It's kind of the 50%, or if depending on.
I would say that your floating, that your belly, your skagit's head should be at least twice as heavy as your sink tip. So to give you an example, if you have a 300 grain Scout, that's another airflow line that it's really great, and we can talk about the shorter stuff a little bit later. If you have a 300 grains head and put 200 grains sink tip on it, it simply is, there's not enough mass in your head to move the sink tip. So it should be I would say no heavier than half of it, than 50%. So 150 grains would be absolute max that you can move with that line. But I would probably, on 300 grains head, I would probably use sink tip that is no longer length is the variable, but no heavier than 100 grains.
Okay, yeah, 100 grains, good. That gives it. And let's take it back to that fist, just because that's the line. Mm-hmm. It's on top of my mind. So I can't remember exactly, but if you had say a 400 grain or 450 grain fist line for an 8 weight, something like that, that's in the ballpark.
Yeah, absolutely. You would be able to use easily 150 grain sink tip. So either 10, 11 feet of T14 or even longer T11 tip.
Okay. And can you again, we're going back on some stuff we've talked about, but the T series is another little bit of confusion. So you clarified it there pretty well when you said T11 and T14, and a lot of guests have said that is the length, they're the size they use. But and what is that? Can you talk about the grains, the equivalents? Just talk a little bit about grains in the T series, how that all works.
Right, it's pretty simple. So the number behind the T indicates the weight per foot of that particular material. So the T11 foot of T11 material weighs 11 grains. So if you have a 10-foot sink tip, your sink tip is going to be 110 grains.
Gotcha. That's
if
awesome.
you have a T14, the foot of that material will be 14 grains per foot.
Perfect.
And so 10 feet of T14 will be 140 grains. And that's pretty much standard winter sink tip, I would say, for majority of runs from 6 to 3 feet in depth and sort of walking speed current.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's awesome. That's a great clarification. So if you're just getting started out there, you're heading to one of these rivers, Steelhead, or one of the rivers for Steelhead here. Say you start off with that T11, and as far as the length, you do hear sometimes people going shorter, 7 foot, 10 foot. Mm-hmm. I mean, is there a length that it seems like standardizing it where you just say, you know what, I'm going to have T11, 1470, they're all going to be the same length. Is that better to do, or should you mix it up and have shorter lengths?
Well, this is more complicated than just the sort of length and organizing yourself. Why? Because on one hand, the sink tip's supposed to get down and put your fly at the depth that it's sort of the best to present it to a fish holding in the run. But on the other hand, your length of your line, including the sink tip, should be correlated to length of your rod. So you wouldn't take a 13-foot rod, put a 15-foot head on it and 10-foot sink tip, because at this point your entire rig is so short that most of the time you will blow your anchor.
Oh, right.
The short line also turns over faster than the longer line. So your cast will turn over prematurely and just basically crash on the surface. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that your rod length, your line length and sink tip length produce the sort of uniform system that works together. What I already mentioned, that you wouldn't put probably the Skagit Scout line on the 13-foot rod because it's extremely short head that packs the weight into the very short length.
Yeah.
And it's used to move fair amount of weight with a fairly short rod. So the compact weight acts a little bit like a something that you can actually throw further out. So to make this sort of simple, for that 13-foot 7 or 8 weight, I would recommend the Skagit Fist or standard G2 Skagit plus 10 to 12, in extreme cases, 15 feet of either T11 or T14.
Yep.
And for the Scout and this appropriate sink tip I would use on a shorter rod, like our compact Spey, that is only 12 feet long, and it's perfectly matching the shorter belly, like the Skagit Scout.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's awesome. And the rule again that you just clarified it in way more detail, but this is kind of the rule. What is it? The 3x, where if you have a 13-foot rod, you multiply it by 3, and then you don't want your entire line setup to be longer than that.
Yeah, that's a ballpark, I would say.
Yeah.
A lot of depends on the caster also.
Oh, okay.
A good caster will probably be able to make it work out rig that it's a little bit off those specs. But for somebody who is beginning, that guideline is sort of 3 times the length of the rod is fairly good beginning.
Yeah, good beginning. Okay, and also, is there a resource again? We're talking about focusing on the fist, but if somebody, say they had a different rod or a different line, where would they go if they want to say they didn't know what line to get for that rod? Is there a good place to, I don't know. I mean, I know Rio has some stuff out there, but any recommendations there?
Well, Echo has its own chart recommending mainly Echo lines or airflow lines to Echo rods. So, and those are very well matching the rods to the line. So I would definitely recommend to go on the Echo website or Airflow website or Rage of Sport website better and look into the resources, and there's going to be a chart that they can use. Okay, perfect. So let's just to wrap this up here again, thinking about the fist, we're thinking winter steelhead. We got an 8 weight, we're a 13 foot, we're heading out. So that fist line, can you talk about that with that rule of 3? So what is typically what is the length of the line? And again, to go back, you're going to have your regular backing. You're still going to have backing on your reel. You're going to have your running line, and then you're going to actually have the fist. What is the length of that fist line, and then how would that relate to, as far as the T11 and making it close to that rule of 3? Sure. So if we would take an 8 weight full Spey, we would probably go. It depends on the caster. The beginner.
What if you're a beginner? So I'm just talking about me again. This is I've been doing it a little, quite a while, but I'm still not a pro. I'm not a great caster, so I still consider myself kind of more at the beginner intermediate. What if you had somebody like that?
Well, then I would match the full Spey 8 weight with Skagit Fist 570 grains. That's the sort of 8-9 designation. The better you are at casting it, because that's just simply is going to load rod very easily and make you cast right away comfortably. And I would put 10 or 12 feet of T11 or T14 on that rig. And that would give us, these lines are at 23 and a half feet length.
Okay.
So that would give us almost 40 feet of entire line, including sink tip, divided by 3 would end very close to 13 foot.
Yeah. That's it. Okay. So that would give us our full setup. Okay. That makes sense. And again, that's the reason why you wouldn't go with necessarily a really short 5-foot tip or a really long tip, because it would throw off that balance. I
mean, with fist having front of the line already type 6 sinking material, you could shorten your sink tip in a shallower run instead of switching to the full floating belly and then putting a 10-foot sink tip on it. You could still use fist with a short, let's say 5-foot T-tip. That would change a little bit of the balance by shortening the entire line. So you would have to be careful with your anchor to not blow your anchor all the time. But it would be actually possible to fish effectively without changing the whole line.
Okay, that makes so you could still use the short tips.
Absolutely, you would short, since in front of your fist is already sinking. You can extend it by 5 feet and cover that more shallow water where you don't have to dig deep.
Okay, perfect. And you just touched on, you said type 6, which kind of gets us back into the another sinking line standard, right? This is kind of more back to the Maybe let's just talk about let's first think about the triple density. Can you describe what in the fist is a triple density line? What is that? What is the triple density?
Well, the triple density means that the line is composed of 3 sections of different density material. So the back of the line, close to your running line, is the floating section, roughly 1/3 of the line. The middle of the line is made out of intermediate sinking material, 1.5 inches per second. And then the front portion, 1/3, is made out of sinking material. And type 6 probably runs around 4 to 6 inches per second, which is not super fast, but what it does, it allows you to cut immediately after the cast is placed, and you mend your floating back of the head, floating portion of the head. The intermediate and sinking portion cuts through the surface currents, which usually are very complex and start sort of waving your line around, preventing you from making good swing. And they cut through those surface current and get deeper where the current is slower already, and your entire swing begins to be slower. You're fishing at much slower rate than your full floating head that sticks to the surface currents and sort of drags your sink tip and fly behind it. There is a purpose to that floating portion. It's not only for you to see where your line is in the water on the water surface, but also to fish completely to the full downstream position of your fly. In steelhead fishing, this is super important, that you don't pull your line out too early and make another cast, because fish very often, it's either hanging out on the side of the current closer to the bank, or they follow the fly from the position in the current into the bank, and very often take at the point where the fly is straight below you. You can even hold there for a few seconds, extra few seconds to make sure that you get that fish that did follow your fly.
I see. Yeah.
So by adding much faster sinking material to the front of the fist, which is already sinking at that rate of 4 to 6 inches per second, you increasing your ability to fish deeper. Even with unweighted fly, that line will keep it providing that you're using very short tippet, that line will allow you to keep that fly deeper, longer. And also, by using fly that is not heavily weighted, you have a lot more movement in that fly. So it's more attractive to fish.
Okay. And then on the end of that, of the fist line, you're mentioning that's the type 6. You would also add your typical C tip, T series. And then, so would you ever on that just add are you always adding a sink tip on the end of that fist, or is there other lines you might add, like maybe an intermediate section?
I think it always ends up with the sink tip, especially for winter fishing.
Yeah.
And skagit head, it can be used definitely for summer steelhead, but it's not as pleasant to fish as the floating shooting heads are, like the Scandi shooting heads. So in the winter, I would say I'm going to fish sink tip. In the summer also, on the shoots in the middle of the day when it's sunny and hot and fish are down, your best chance to get the fish during that period is putting on your skagit head and sink tip and getting your fly down closer to the bottom where fish are sort of hanging out there.
Well, what if you were on the Deschutes in the summertime and it was blowing 50 miles an hour, like it does, and your Scandi line, you're not that great with the Scandi, and it's killing you, but your heavier skagit line, could you stick on just that with a floating? Would that work if you're doing an evening, morning sort of thing where you are on the surface?
Mm-hmm. Well, first thing I would try the Rage Compact line, which is designed by Tom Larimer specifically for such conditions.
Yeah.
And Tom's been guiding for ages on the Deschutes, and that line has a very powerful, it's sort of a cross line between the Scandi and Skagit, so it has a very powerful turnover. You can put a poly leader or floating or mono leader, and you can still fish in the wind that it's pretty strong. But definitely Skagit head's going to be way more effective in cutting through the wind. I mean, the dynamics of the water-loaded or sustained anchor cast are such that you have a lot more line speed and a lot more power in that cast. So absolutely, I see on the Deschutes people fishing Skagit lines throughout the summer, and I'm sure they're catching a lot of fish.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I had Tom Larimer was on way back in episode 11. Mm-hmm. And he talked about, I think we did, actually he told a funny story about the rage, the guy fishing the rage out on a rock in his Speedos out in the Deschutes. So it was pretty funny. but yeah, okay. So this is good. I think we've done a pretty good job here. Obviously there's going to be some people that there's still some questions, talking about the type 6 and different types and that whole thing. But, I think just as far as time, I think maybe we can just touch. I wanted to get into the Kamchatka because that's a place that, I would love to get to someday. I know everybody that loves Steelhead would love to get there, and most of us won't ever get there. But can you describe, take us to Kamchatka and, just like take us to a river, maybe one you're most familiar with, and what that's like and how that's different from, say, you're just on, out here in one of our winter Steelhead rivers.
Well, the rivers I fished on Kamchatka, Steelhead rivers, were two Utkhulak and Kvachina rivers, which are operated by conservation angler. There's a little NGO that's been working in Kamchatka with Wild Salmon Center for many, many years. We provided some of the scientific research with them. And these rivers are not your typical Pacific Northwest rivers. They are they're similar to Alaska rivers, very low gradient, not very fast. You fish in a tidal zone. Very often you can see fish actually coming from the salt into the estuary and then moving further up the river. So it's not your typical Pacific Northwest steelheading, but it's absolutely fascinating to fish river that it's the bottom is covered with small pebble from bank to bank, has a little deeper area undercut bank cover with high grass, and you almost want to cast to the other bank and pull the fly off the grass into that channel, and then all of a sudden you attach to 15, 20 pounds, absolutely bar of silver. These fish have to survive under the ice during the winter for 8 months almost. So they packed on weight before they enter the river to the point where they have a very small head and huge hump. Wow. They're incredibly well prepared for winter. And there's many of them, and they're completely wild. So it's a once in a lifetime experience. What's great about this river and all Kamchatka steelhead rivers is that steelhead are listed in the Russian Red Book of Threatened and Endangered Species. So fishing for them is not permitted except for the scientific research. So the conservation angler is doing almost 30 years by now of research on these fish. They get a permit from Moscow Academy of Sciences, and anglers are basically catching fish, and scientists are taking samples from these fish. So it's a very unique opportunity to fish for steelhead that never been really touched by any anthropogenic factors. No dams, no agriculture, no hatcheries, no commercial fishery also. So I would definitely recommend the fly shop in Reading is providing all the logistics for those trips, and I would highly recommend it. These guys are doing great job and that opportunity is there. Another river, which is not exactly a steelhead river, but the fish are on par with steelhead as far as size and condition, is the Jupanova River. That's one of the best rainbow trout fisheries.
And how do you spell? Can we go back to the Ulak? How do you spell that? And how do you spell that one?
UTKHOLK.
Okay, we got that one. Then how do you spell this one you just mentioned? The next one.
ZHUPANOVA.
Oh wow! Okay, that's amazing. That's a mouthful. Okay, so yeah, now we've got and how do you pronounce that again?
Jupanova.
Okay, and now talk about on that one. How is that one? Is that a little bit different than the other one?
Yeah, the system is a lot more spectacular as far as the scenery is concerned. The flows through the landscape that it's studded with big active volcanoes, and you have a choice of float where you take rafts down the river from the upper section all the way down to the Zenzer Lodge, which is somewhere in the middle of the river, or you can stay at the Zenzer Lodge and then you take a jet boat around every day and fish there. They're also, beside the massive and numerous rainbow trout, there are also something called kunja, which is white spotted char. Some of them are resident, some of them are anadromous. There's, of course, almost all Pacific salmon present in this river, coho, and other species, but they're not the main attraction. The rainbow trout, up to 34 inches, are the main attraction, and you can fish single-handed, double-handed rod. You can fish dry fly. You can fish streamers. So it's an incredible resource.
Are there steelhead in that system as well?
No, they're not.
Okay, so that is okay. That gets back. Yeah, we had that conversation again back with John McMill, and we were talking about how the steelhead distribution ends up in Alaska, eventually, and we talked about why that is. And I guess there's probably in this other river with the rainbows, there's more salmon. Is that the case? Yeah, absolutely.
The salmon is the component that makes the rainbow trout so fat and so big and grow at such a fast rate.
That's it. Okay. And this is kind of off on a tangent a little bit, but you mentioned the Moscow Sciences. I mean, it's interesting because right now, politics, obviously, we're not going to jump into that. But, right now there's this crazy stuff with the politics going on where Russia is, talking about influencing our elections and eco or terrorism online and stuff. I mean, it seems like you've got all that going. How does the science, is that just separate, or are you affected by the whole Russia, whatever's going on with Putin and his thing?
Yes and no. So science has been always a little bit exempt from the politics. Wild Salmon Center was working with in Russia based on bilateral agreement between U.S. and Russia, which is called Area 5 Agreement. And that's agreement on scientific research and conservation of endangered and threatened species. There's a section in that agreement that it's on salmonid. So we work under sort of government agreement umbrella. If you're asking me if the work in Russia has been getting more difficult, absolutely. There's no question about it. Yes, it is. I mean, it is more difficulties in getting permits for certain research. Some of the American NGOs have harassed by authorities in Russia, but we've been always sort of working on a strict scientific base, so we're avoiding a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these activities by just simply being focused on fish instead of politics.
That makes sense, and I guess that's the thing. It's like Putin and the whole crew, they're not that focused on steelhead, so it's probably not obviously not critical for them.
No, they're not. Even though some of the Putin administration, and including Putin, have been known to fish.
Oh, no kidding.
Sport fish. Yeah, he's been shown with the large pike.
Where without a T-shirt, right? With
right, right. Prime Minister who just finished his career yesterday, I believe, been fishing Kola Peninsula, has been to the Penoy River multiple times. So there's a lot of Russians. Fishing in Russia is incredibly popular.
Oh, it is.
On one hand, that's a good thing because we working with more and more people who realize that without conservation, without taking care of these ecosystems and fish, they will be gone. On the other, that's the good part. The bad part is that fishing is probably one of the most popular pastimes in Russia, and is definitely connected to consumption of your catch. And that presents a significant challenge for introduction of catch and release regulations and other conservation measures.
Yeah. So you don't ever think you're sitting there talking about, on the news or whatever, that Putin's going to track you down and take you out for saying the wrong thing? That's not something that's ever on your mind?
No, not at all. No.
Good.
I had a few encounters with authorities, but they were usually they ended up on the positive note.
Good.
And we've been able to, so far so good. We've been able to continue our program.
Yeah. No, and I think obviously the U.S. we have our own share of problems, and the thing I do think about, I think Russia, I think their economy is based, right? The oil and gas is a huge.
Right.
Basically, I think their whole economy is based on that. So you have that struggle here, where we're obviously talking about trying to, I don't know, maybe get away from that eventually to more cleaner.
Right.
Methods. But I think again that we've we've got topics here we're digging into that are entire hours and hours. So I want to stick with the fishing. We're talking about the rivers, and these are like you mentioned, they're more like Alaska than they are, say, the kind of the other West Coast rivers we have. What else should we know about? So I think the fly shop, you said, if somebody wants to go there, the best chance is to talk to the fly shop. That's the best.
Yeah, they've been working in Russia for many, many years. I have been on both Utkhulok and Zhupanova trip organized by the fly shop, and they do fantastic job with all the logistics, which are complicated in Russia, as you can imagine, are done incredibly professionally, and experience is one of the best I ever had. And I've been around a little bit between the Kola Peninsula and Russian Far East and British Columbia, so I would highly recommend. Zhupanova is a lot more spectacular than because it's a southern part of the Kamchatka, not very far from PK, which is Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, which is the sort of capital of the Kamchatka Peninsula. So you fly there from U.S. There's direct flight from Alaska during the summer from Anchorage, which takes only 4.5 hours. Yes. And you end up straight in PK. Then after a short break, you transfer to helicopter. And within 45 minutes, you're going to be on the river, which is probably the fastest I ever traveled to destination in Russia.
Yeah. Is it? So it's getting a little bit easier as you've gone over the years to get to Russia and do that whole trip?
Yeah, especially to Kamchatka. Fly Shop has done a very good job on trying to establish direct flight during the season between Anchorage and Petropavlovsk. And they will have it next year as well. It's operated by Air Yakutia, which is a sort of subleasing company, but it flies American equipment, and it's incredibly comfortable, fast, and efficient.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's, and the Spey casting thing is another struggle. We talked about the rod and gear, and maybe we just briefly talk a little bit about with Speycast, I had, I'm just thinking in our Facebook group, Kurt Taylor had a question on, we're not going to be able to cover all the how-to and tips and things like that, but is there a resource, if somebody wanted to learn spey casting, they didn't have money to pay a guide, is there a good resource out there where somebody can kind of learn? What would you recommend on that?
There's been a lot of videos made on spey casting, but I would definitely look at Deg Hogan Modern Spey Casting. That would be an instructional video that it's really great. And I don't believe that there's been anything better written on steelhead fishing than Deg's book. Steelhead fishing, due to the fact that there's so few fish around, can be really sort of frustrating. And Deg has the incredible sort of no-nonsense approach to walking newcomer through the hoops of steelhead fishing, and that's as far as I know the least romantic but most practical writing on steelhead fishing that I ever came across. So these two things wouldn't cost much more than $50 and would allow somebody to start well. Another resource used to be the Spey pages. There used to be, right now it's a little bit less active from my point of view, or I became less involved. Sure. But during the sort of skagit method development period, Ed Ward was involved very heavily, and I remember his sort of instruction or farewell posts to the steelheaders that listed sort of few basic points: 1 rod, 1 line, 1 sink tip, 3 flies. Yep. And I think what's the most important thing, the only way to learn something about steelhead fishing is actually doing it instead of watching it or reading about it. And that was his advice. Get out as often as you can, even if it's for a few hours, on 1-2 runs that are close in, and fish them as often as you can. And eventually you will come across the fish. Because the only way to really learn is to have these encounters with steelhead. Yeah. They will teach you what to do, what not to do, and because there's few fish around, the more often you go out there and do it, the faster you're going to learn. That was the incredible experience on the Penoy River, which is famous for the great numbers of salmon, that the learning curve was incredibly steep, since you had many encounters daily with salmon, and you were able to learn very quickly. With steelhead, we are not that fortunate, unless you go to Utkhulak or Skina, where you might increase your chances of encounters with steelhead. So that would be my advice.
Those are great tips. I'll put links to the videos and the books and things you talked about there in the show notes of this episode, and that's good. Well, let's just jump into it as we start to kind of wrap this thing up. The 222 is a way I always kind of check in with everybody on it's the kind of the top 2 tips, top 2 flies, and top 2 resources. And obviously we're focusing on steelhead here, and you mentioned some tips. Maybe we could just start with flies. Do you have, if you had to pick a couple of flies you were going to use for steelhead, what's in your box?
Wow, that's a good question. John Hazel said a long time ago that if they wanted, they'll take your car keys. That's right. I wouldn't be attached to a particular pattern, even though fishing Deschutes in the summer, you would go for example, steelhead coachman would be my favorite fly on the Deschutes during the summer, in size everywhere from 8 all the way up to 4. Okay. It's a sort of on the opposite spectrum from Freight Train or a Purple Peril, that is a little bit more natural. Right, exactly. It's a little bit subdued, and I feel that very often that's what Deschutes fish in the summer like. Even though Early in the shoot season, you put on a nice intruder and sink tip, and you're probably going to do even better. And in the late season as well, very late season, let's say December. For the winter steelhead, the selection right now on the market. I mean, I used to tie a lot of flies and been fascinated with design of the steelhead flies. Went through the intruder period very hard, but then I ended up fishing sylvanator most of the time. Oh, yeah. So that would be my winter favorite pattern, which is basically orange or blue or pink bead on the tube with the rabbit strip behind it. Again, black, pink, or purple. And that would be my favorite winter steelhead fly.
Okay, perfect. No, I'll put links to that in the show notes. And I actually have, I think I did a YouTube tutorial, a little video on the steelhead coachman is out there somewhere. So yeah, those are all good. And then if you think about tips, you mentioned a few tips already, but if you think about, I mean, I guess we're talking steelhead here, but we could also talk casting. Would you have a couple of good tips you might give somebody that's either struggling with either steelhead fishing or with spey, casting the two-handed rod?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. The first one and the most important from my point of view is putting together your entire rig properly. That means having the rod, a length adjusted to length of your skagit head. So if your rod is above 12 feet or let's say around 13 and a half, very few people use 14 footers anymore for steelhead fishing, which is also sort of symptomatic how the lines and rods evolve together during the development of the skagit style of casting. So make sure that your skagit head is heavy enough for your rod and long enough for your rod. Then you can play with just few sink tips in two densities. I would say T11, T14, 10 feet, 12 feet range would be the sort of most useful length. And make sure that this whole rig is well balanced, which means the weight and length correlates between rod, skagit head, and a sink tip.
Yep. Perfect.
So that would be... Okay. That would be the most important thing. And then, of course, getting out there and practicing. There's no way around practicing. I don't care how good teacher you're going to hire for 1 hour, or how many books you're going to read, or how many tapes you're going to watch people casting, even though for me, the visual part actually helped a lot at the beginning. If you're not experimenting by yourself, even if the river is blown out, I go sometimes out there just to cast and make sure that I stay tuned with my skagit casting. Yep. And sort of another thing that it's important, when the two-handed fishing and casting came to US, there was a huge sort of frustration with styles. There was a traditional style, Scandi, and then some people started developing this sort of catered to steelhead fishing, skagit casting. The mixing of those styles, for example, using long belly line on the short rod will just end up with frustration. Yeah. So staying within a certain style is very important. Let's say, I think most of us, there are people who fish floating line and lightly weighted spey fly during the winter, but most of us fish definitely skagit heads and sink tips during the winter. So important is to sort of understand that this type of rig requires certain style of casting. So when I see people, of course, Scott O'Donnell can single spey cast skagit head with intruder because he's so good he can cast actually anything, just like Steve Rajeff. Yeah. But most of us regular mortals have to follow certain rules to be able even to get out stuff out there. And so I would definitely, if you decided to fish skagit, you should stick with water-loaded casts or sustained anchor cast, which is the whole separate sort of subject. And I think Edward is by far the most the best resource to follow on casting, skagit casting. Yeah. He's done a lot of films about it, and so sticking to the principles of skagit casting will also help to shorten your sort of learning process.
Yeah, and you mentioned three guys: Scott O'Donnell, Tim Rajeff, and Ed Ward, three names that come up a lot in the Steelhead game, as guys that were leading the way early on. What do you think? I mean, when you look at those guys, I'm not sure how well obviously you know Tim very well, but do you see something, what makes those guys, the immortal? I mean, why do they stand out from the rest of the group?
Well, they've been on the forefront of the most important sort of developments of last 20 years in two-handed fishing and rod designing, line designing, and also fishing. I mean, all these guys have one thing in common: they've been for many years fishing, casting, guiding. Just being very passionate about the sport. Yeah. And that sort of, some of them are incredibly creative, like Ed Ward. I mean, who would come up with the 15-foot skagit head, 20 years ago? Nobody would even think about it. And Ed has been pioneering that stuff from the very beginning. Yep. Same with Tim. I mean, Tim's been involved in tournament casting since he'd been, 7 years old, and probably at that same age participated in the first national tournament and then straight into international competitions. And then he worked with Gary Loomis and his brother for many years designing rods at Loomis. Yeah. So the amount of experience, the amount of expertise these guys have is just simply impossible for recreational fishermen to match, and that's why for us is incredible resource that can help us shortcut this whole process. And Scott O'Donnell been guiding forever for Steelhead, and that experience accumulates and provides person with skills, unmatchable skills by other people. Yeah. So
yeah. No, it is. It's just and I guess for anybody out there who's new to it, I mean, they could realize that they could probably maybe at some point have the same contribution down the line.
Right.
Anybody can, again, the passion, it's kind of that word, the passion for Steelhead, but it's true. That's why I think it resonates so well, because obviously, if you're going to sit out in a run for hours and hours, sometimes without a fish even touching it, that takes something to do that. Right. Right.
Absolutely. I mean, Steelhead fishing is that way. That, the bottom line is you have to come across, player. Yep. Deck, we'll call it. And if you don't, you left with just fishing as well as you can, the best water you have available, and eventually you will come across the steelhead, and it's an incredible experience.
Yeah. That's good. What is something that you think over the years, you're most proud of when you think about what you've done? Sounds like you've done yourself a ton. I mean, could you pick a thing out there that you're really proud of?
The conservation is the most important part of my history. I think the longer you fish, the more passionate you are about it, the more you realize that we all, industry, anglers, outfitters, businesses rely on this free resource out there, which we slowly starting to lose, which is just being diminished by our own activities.
Yeah.
And I think the realization that that my responsibility is to do something for that resource, to do something about these fish, to help them somehow. That made me work make that my job, my 8 hours a day or more job, is something that I can be proud of. There's been different things like winning the Spey-orama in San Francisco in 2006, which was the first sort of Spey casting competition in the U.S. and probably one of the first in the world, and bringing all these phenomenal casters from around the world, like the Steelhead brothers from Norway, guys from Scotland, and all over the place, and sort of helping all of us to learn from them. That's something to be proud of. But I think the conservation and realization that we owe back to that resource, that's maybe not achievement, but I'm proud that it sort of, I ended up realizing that I have to give back.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, without the the stuff, the groups that you're working for, I mean, we'd probably be in a much worse off place as far as Steelhead runs. And Steelhead and the Spey-orama, I mean, what did that feel like when back in 2006? That's you're at the pinnacle, right? You win that thing, and you're one of the best casters in the world. How did that feel? A lot of work went into it. It felt good. Definitely the mission accomplished kind of feeling. But at that point, I also realized that the truly thing that I am after is fishing. And then after that realization that the thing I'm after is being on the river and doing something good for the environment. That's probably sort of chain of events growing up as a fisherman and caster and conservationist. Yeah. And we're going to wrap this thing up pretty quick here. I was just kind of on that line a little bit. And I'm going to, the 222, we already kind of wrapped up because you talked about a bunch of resources. So I'm not going to dig more into that. But, one of the struggles I think out there is that on the conservation piece, I think people tune out a lot, even though people know it's important. How do you guys at the Wild Salmon Center help people to not tune out, right? Because they hear that these negative things and they just would rather not listen to it. Is there anything you guys focus on, or is that something, are you more just focused on protecting the resource and let other groups find out a way to connect with people?
No, we realize that, without support of not only donors, but public in general and anglers as well, we're not going to succeed. There's no way. So our approach is to engage. Obviously, we are a small NGO in Portland, Oregon, and we work across Pacific Rim. So we rely on partners. We have partners in California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, and across the ocean in Russia, in Mongolia. And we used to work even in Japan on Sakhalin taimen conservation. So having those relationships, as many of them and as strong, as real, and as productive as we can, is the most important. We help, for example, develop something called Russian Salmon Fund in Russia, in Moscow. Now is entirely Russian NGO. It's still our partner, but they're on their own, and they're the sort of spearheading salmon conservation movement in Russia. So. Go on our website and see, we publicize stuff about our projects all the time, and you can learn, you can see, I think, people sort of turn off the whole environmental issue because they feel like we are powerless, and that's not true. And only realizing how many people are involved and how successful they are. For example, Skina. So I'll give the Skina example since I'm very familiar with this. A few years ago, International Consortium Petronas, Oil and Gas Consortium, proposed LNG plant at the mouth of the Skeena on the Lilu Islands, right in the mouth of the Skeena. So I'm not sure if many people that fish Skeena even knew about it.
No.
So
what year was that? What year was that?
That was 3 years ago, I would say.
So recently. Wow.
Very recently. And local community, first of all, First Nations, who have a lot of power and still rights to their traditional territories, just got together and put so much occupy the island and put so much pressure on the authorities, on the government, that the project was removed from the proposal. And Skeena is never going to be imperiled by the LNG development pipeline, oil by rail or tankers. Yeah. So there's many people. I mentioned the Skeena Wild Conservation Trust that on the ground, not necessarily fishermen, just people who care about the environment they live in. After all, it's not something that is abstract. It is actually a place where we all live, where we all rely on our kids will be here and their kids hopefully will be here. So nobody should turn off the volume and stop thinking about it and just go fishing, enjoying it as long as it lasts. I think we can get together, and when you think about the power of the sport fishing community, I think sport fishing is probably, by the number of sold licenses, the most popular outdoor activity in the United States. Oh, wow. And if we all just get together and care for the resources that we use daily, for example, the Deschutes River. I fish the Deschutes River, therefore I am active with the Deschutes River Alliance, Lower Deschutes River Alliance, and I'm a donor to that organization because I fish that river so often. So I think we can all do a little bit more, not a lot.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, the Skeena is a good example because, like you said, a lot of I'm not sure about how the forests are. Well, I think Canada actually has quite a bit of harvesting of their forest too. So there's probably some of those things up there. But just the fishing, I know steelhead aren't necessarily targeted out there, but it just seems like the ocean is such, and again, we can get back to climate change and stuff, but it's such a wild west, right? Because you got these boats out there. I mean, is that, not to dig too far into this, but again, is that something on your radar, thinking about how, steelhead are getting hit out there with nets or whatever else? Is that still a major problem, say for a Kamchatka steelhead?
No, not really for Kamchatka steelhead, because Russians don't fish for salmon in open ocean. From 1964, all salmon Russian fisheries are terminal fisheries. That means that they're nets that are placed either on the shore or at the mouth of the rivers. So they're targeting particular populations and are able to actually monitor the number of fish being caught and being sure that they are not fishing in a mixed stock fishery like we do in Alaska and like Canadians do in British Columbia. Yep. In British Columbia, especially in the Skeena, I think I mentioned the Skeena Wild Conservation Trust. Just to give you an idea how much things have changed within the last decade or so, the number of commercial gill netters at the Skeena, at the mouth of the Skeena, has been probably down from 1,500 10 years ago to 200 right now. And it's also the result of the conservation efforts of NGOs and local community. So there are simply licensed buyouts, and the government is retiring certain fisheries. So there are very positive developments and tendencies. In Kamchatka, the biggest problem is probably the poaching. Just the illegal harvest in river, mostly targeting fish eggs. So the fish are being just discarded and eggs are being sold to internal or foreign markets.
Gotcha.
But there's a progress with that as well, mostly through MSC, Marine Stewardship Council certifications. The Russian fisheries, in order to access European and U.S. North American general market, have to be MSC certified. That's for sustainability, and one of the conditions to be certified is taking care of enforcement on the river. So I would say in Kamchatka, within the last 25 years that we have been working there, the level of illegal fishing has been also decreasing dramatically.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, obviously that's a major, big topics we're talking about here. So, well, we'll leave that for the next one, baby. But in the next 6 to 12 months, anything new coming up for you, the Salmon Center, Echo, anything you want to let us know?
Wild Salmon Center is sort of going into the scientific program in Mongolia on Siberian taimen conservation. Mongolia, as you know, and most of anglers know, has been a destination for last 20 years or more. Yep. And American operators there noticed that there is a certain decline, right? And there are many issues. There's poaching, there's overgrazing, there's habitat loss. So we will be venturing, since we have a very active taimen conservation program in Russian Far East, we will be joining Mongolia Outfitters Company with the science program. With cool. Echo, I think we are done for a while with new Spey rods. We feel like the full Spey, compact Spey, and trout Spey cover the basis, and they're very good rods. We don't like to change product every 2 years. Yeah. Because it confuses retailers as well as it does. As well as customers. So we're going to be sticking, but we're constantly working on the new line developments. So I wouldn't want to give any commercial secrets. Sure. At this point,
so you got a quadruple density maybe in the works. maybe. So one quick one just on the full Spey. So you also have what is it, the swing? Isn't there a swing series?
Yes.
So what's the difference between the full Spey and the Echo swing? Because I have a 6-weight swing, I believe, and
fantastic.
Yeah, it's a good rod. What is the difference? If somebody's buying, I mean, would they? I know one's a lower price point, but are there any other differences to think about with those two?
Well, a little bit with the length. So all our full Speys are 13 footers because we feel that it's a sort of right on the money length. The swings are a little bit more traditional, not only in an action sense. They have a similar action to full Spey, except full Spey is made out of very high modulus material, so lighter, faster recovery. But swings are incredibly good value and very good rods. So the 6, 7, 8 again in space from 12.5 through 13 to 13.5. So if you would like to have a longer rod than 13 foot, I would recommend the swing 8-weight 13.5. If you would like a little bit longer, a little bit shorter rod in 6-weight, like the summer steelhead rod, swing has 12.5 6-weight, which is fantastic.
Okay, so
and you have your workhorse 13-foot 7-weight in that.
In that too.
For incredible price.
So if you had somebody coming in for, they were just wanted their first intro rod for, say, all around steelhead fishing, you could the Echo 7-weight, 13-foot 7-weight, or the swing, or
the swing.
Yeah.
The swing. Definitely, I would go with the 7-weight 13-foot swing as my first rod. And from there, I would find out what I like and then upgrade to either 12-foot rod in the compact Spey.
Gotcha.
If that's your game, if your river is good for that kind of outfit, or full Spey, and then you also will know if 13 is your favorite rod, or you would like to upgrade a little bit higher, then you can go to the swing in 13.5.
I gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So the full is, like you said, it's a little lighter, faster. So if somebody just wanted the kind of the more, the faster rod, maybe the full would be the better rod to start with. Or if they already had some experience, they just wanted to get it. Yeah. Okay. Definitely. Gotcha. Okay. Good. So like I said, I have a link at wetflyswing.com/echo, which redirects over to the Gorge, and that's the shop that we kind of work with locally. So that's good. Well, that's all I have. We've kind of, obviously, I think there's still a ton of stuff we could talk about, but I'll let you get out here and respect your time here.
No worries.
But yeah, I just appreciate you coming on and talking about. I really didn't know all the background as much as the stuff we dug in here. So it's amazing, all the conservation and steelhead and echo. So I'm definitely going to reach back out to you and circle around and stay in touch as we move forward. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes, all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/123. If you want to find out a little more on upcoming trips we have, just go to wetflyswing.com/destination, and you can get filled in on upcoming new trips that are on the list. I just want to thank you for your support. It'd be great if you could click the subscribe button so you can get updated when a new episode comes out, and it'll also help others find the show. It has to do with the algorithm. I don't know exactly how, but that's part of the game. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon. I hope to maybe see you on the river or online.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.